Welcome back, Left Reckoners. David here, joined as always by Matt Leck. How you doing, brother?
I'm doing good, David. Good to be with you.
Yeah, man, and we're really excited we're doing another damage story, as we do a lot on this program. We're joined this week by Dustin Dino Guastella, who's a research associate at the Center for Working Class Politics and Director of Operations for Teamsters Local 623 in Philly. Dino, thank you so much for talking with us.
Thanks for having me, guys. I'm glad to be here. Glad to be back in a way.
Yeah, no, totally. I mean, we're big fans. I mean, I've really appreciated your writing. In many places, your piece on antisocial socialism is one of my personal favorites. But we're here to talk about something different, which is this new piece in the second issue of Damage Magazine, Making the Present the Enemy of the Future. And we're going to be talking about harm reduction politics and policies when it comes to drugs. Maybe to get us started here, you note in your piece that overdose deaths in Kensington, Philadelphia, about 20% of overdose deaths in Philadelphia were in Kensington, despite that neighborhood only accounting for 2% of the population. I mean, how did we get here? How did this happen?
Yeah, Kensington is in a rough place right now, and it has been for some time. Some people say that it's the largest open-air drug market on the East Coast. I don't really know how you measure that kind of thing, but the fact that it's even in the conversation says a lot about where the neighborhood is. Many years ago, the neighborhood was the kind of industrial heartland of Philadelphia. It was one of the most industrialized neighborhoods in the city. It had the most amount of factories. It had the most amount of workers. It had a large, vibrant working class union activity, lots of working class social activity. And, as with the rest of the country, as deindustrialization started to take hold and factories started to close as a result of automation and offshoring, the neighborhood slowly started to fall apart. And by the 1990s, as factories were leaving in sort of record numbers with NAFTA, the neighborhood really went under. And nothing filled that void after deindustrialization. So what happens to a lot of deindustrialized towns is, poverty and drug use. And in Kensington, it just took on an order of magnitude that was a lot higher than a lot of other places. And the city has struggled for decades with how to deal with it. And we're going to talk a little bit about some of the strategies that they've used. But right now, Kensington is synonymous with drug abuse and addiction. And if you walk up and down Kensington Avenue or Kensington and Allegheny and Lehigh, these areas, you'll see just drug addicts, tons and tons of drug addicts on the street. And it's tragic. It's one of the most tragic scenes that you can see in any city. And it's, especially tragic knowing the history of that neighborhood in particular, and how far it's fallen from being a kind of stable working class neighborhood to being what it is today.
So just because I haven't spent a lot of time in Philly, I'll admit. So, to help me understand here too, is like when it comes to, the folks in Kensington, who are addicted like this, I mean, is this have like a high correlation with people who are homeless as well? Or is this something that is sort of like the population of Kensington is just like very much experiencing?
Yeah, it's both. I mean, there are lots of people in Kensington living, in regular row homes like they would in any other part of Philadelphia, but there are lots of people living on the street in Kensington as well. Probably more than most of the rest of, I'm certain a lot more than the rest of the city. And those tent encampments, the city has recently cleared a bunch of the tent encampments. But those tent encampments have been springing up and being cleared for a long time now. And they just sort of move up and down the Ave. They balloon and shrink over time. But it is a lot of homelessness. It's a lot of addicts. And these things go hand in hand in a certain way, right? Like addicts who desperately need a fix need to live close to where they're getting that fix. And a lot of times the easiest way to do that, especially once your life has sort of been turned upside down, is to set up a camp as close as you can to wherever the drug market is. And that's what a lot of these addicts have done. And there's very few shelters. There's very few places for them to go. So they live on the streets. They get their fix on the streets. And that's sort of how they survive.
So I mean, it's sort of implicit in the title here, but I mean, what's the city's strategy been, to sort of dealing with this and, the kind of politics around Kensington right now?
Yeah, so things are up in the air right now. We have a new mayor, and she is taking a much more hardline approach to the drug abuse, or I should say the outdoor drug use. And she is trying to break up the drug market and clear out the encampments. And the goal there is to sort of disperse some of the drug activity and hopefully break up some of the cycle of addiction. But of course, the failure, and we'll get into this, is there's no money for compulsory treatment and there's no space for shelters. So it's, basically breaking up the encampments, enforcing the laws against drug use, but really no solution for the addicts. Up until this point, the strategy had been a kind of hands-off approach, which was allowing the drug use and allowing the encampments to exist, and even, encouraging nonprofits to do needle exchanges and harm reduction, things like this, and hoping that you could contain the problem by simply kind of ignoring it in a way. And that's been the kind of strategy that the previous mayor took. So we're bouncing back and forth between these two strategies, neither of which can really solve the problem, but will continue to create generate new problems therein. And that's sort of where, the argument that I'm trying to make is that we are consistently making the present the enemy of the future. And we're just shoving this problem further into the future as we make it worse and worse.
Yeah, let's talk about this issue with harm reduction. I mean, most people who watch this program, they're familiar with these kind of arguments. This is like something that's it's fairly dominant on the left, right? It's kind of like reduce harm, make drug use safer, decriminalization, all that kind of stuff. What's the issue with that approach? Is it that is that approach in and of itself not sufficient? Is it a problem just in general? I mean, what's the tension here? Apart from it just very clearly, let's just be honest, by the way, just like not working in places like Philadelphia and a lot of places across the country.
Yeah, it's empirically not working. So that's the first thing. And I think people who are advocates of this, it's on them to demonstrate that it is working, because there's at this point a lot of evidence that it's not working. So we can start with saying, what is harm reduction? And it's a lot of things. So having this conversation is often very difficult because people will say, well, harm reduction includes this, massive panoply of solutions. But what we can say is that one thing that is consistent with harm reduction is that it is opposed to preaching any kind of abstinence or, getting clean message, right? One thing that is common among most harm reduction advocates is that they're opposed to saying we should step in and encourage people to get off of drugs, right? In some form or another. And this is, I think, the crux of the problem, right? So what happens in most places where these models are used, and the two main things that get done are needle exchanges, safe injection sites, and the decriminalization of drug use, especially public drug use on the street. Those are the two things that you see many places try to kind of mitigate whatever drug problem they might be having. What happens here, and where I think the logic of this stuff really breaks down, and for those of us on the left, we should think about it very seriously, is effectively those two solutions, if you will, help to grease the drug market. Because what they do is they provide the atmosphere for the black market and drugs to grow uninhibitedly. And so in the minds of many people on the left, you're saying, well, drug users are these people who they have an addiction, they have a problem. The last thing that we want to do is demonize them, throw them in jail, or hurt them in some way. But I think many people think that population is static, that it's just some percentage of the world that's just going to stay that way. And so if we decriminalize and we hand out these needles, it's just going to be this 2% of the population that's going to be doing this. Mm-hmm. And they fail to realize that drug markets, like all markets, want to grow. They want people to get sucked into this. And if you're greasing the market by handing out literally the tools that the drug dealers need to ply their trade, you're going to expand those markets, and they're going to expand and expand and expand without any real way of saying, let's rein this in, let's keep it in, within the bounds of what we originally intended. And so to me, this is the biggest contradiction in the harm reduction literature, is that they often will cite that, they're doing a great job of preventing HIV. And of course, that's definitely true. Clean needles are much better than dirty needles. But there's no evidence that they're doing anything for addiction, because for every few addicts that says, oh, it was thanks to some harm reduction process that I decided to get clean, there are thousands more that otherwise wouldn't have had access to the kind of drugs that they have access to, because the loose laws and the needle exchanges make drug use safer, easier, and more accessible.
Is this too simplistic to say this is really the sort of liberal side of the political sphere taking a sort of libertarian, I don't want to say anarchist, but more libertarian off-ramp? And like you say, this is basically just going to help the commerce of this product be passed, as opposed to, say, go back to a socialist view, which might say, yeah, addiction is a social problem that we need to address.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it seems very libertarian, right? And it's no surprise that the Cato Institute and all the libertarian think tanks are 100% in favor of this stuff. The strange thing is that people on the left are very, I think, committed to it, very morally committed to it. And it's a tough thing to try to figure out how you have a social program that combats addiction when, on one hand, you're sort of, opening up the very market that is producing addiction, and this is what they found in Portugal when they tried this stuff, was that one arm of the government was working feverishly to get people into clinics, and the other arm of the government was literally just handing out needles to anybody who wanted them. And you reach a contradiction where you have to figure out, well, what is our goal here? Is our goal here getting people help, or is our goal here a kind of non-judgmental attitude toward drugs? And I think many on the left want to have their cake and eat it too. They want to be able to say, we have a very open, sort of open-minded approach to drug use, and we want to treat addiction. Well, those things have a tension, and you have to recognize that there is a tension in accepting or pushing both of those philosophies at once.
Yeah,
I think
go ahead.
Sorry, in New York, we've been legalizing pot, and I thought Bhaskar Sankara had a good tweet, which is now Eric Adams is finally doing something that is not entirely not something to oppose, which is that shutting down on the gray market sort of dispensaries. And because now that the state actually is legalizing this stuff, I want that to be regulated. Like, I've walked into some of these fake dispensaries, and you don't know, it seems like half the stuff is brought in from other states and stuff like that. It's like, I'm not cool with that. I want actually there to be some government responsibility for these products moving.
Yeah, totally. And I think it's one of the weird things that, like, we on the left are very opposed to markets, and we see like the problem in introducing marketplaces all the time. But when it comes to drugs, there's this weird hesitancy to recognize that when you're legalizing a drug, you're basically saying, free market, take this. If you don't regulate it really strongly, you're saying, let's let the free market decide how this should be distributed, and the market is going to grow. I mean, if nothing else, drugs are one of the best markets that we've seen in how they grow.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny, like when we talk about other issues like crime, for example, like leftists are quick to sort of talk about how these things are like socially created issues, right? But when it comes to addiction and drug use, you're talking about it being a kind of static population instead of something that is created by certain conditions. I really do want to talk about the left and some of the ways we can move around this. But I do think before we get there, we have to talk about this Portugal model that you alluded to and wrote about in your piece, because this is one of those things that always gets brought up, is that, basically Portugal legalized all, this is the pot version of it, by the way, Portugal legalized all drugs, everything's fine there, and that's basically what we should just do. But that's not really how things worked out in Portugal. Could you give us like an understanding of how that system worked, and the kind of changes that it's gone through?
Yeah, so I would say roughly there are three basic phases. The first was exactly as you described. They decriminalized drugs, and they started doing needle exchanges, right? And immediately they realized that wasn't working. They were like, well, people are just taking these needles and just doing drugs with them. They're like, there's no addiction treatment. So the architect of what is known as the Portuguese model basically said, okay, we're going to keep that stuff in place, but we're going to add compulsory treatment, right? And we're going to start arresting people who are doing drugs on the street, people who are publicly using, right? And by doing that, they actually did get their drug problem under control. They started to really manage to get a lot of people off of super addictive drugs and bring their opioid overdose rates way down and everything. But when the rubber hit the road, they were starting to run out of money, right? And so the first thing that gets cut is the public health side of it, right? The more expensive thing, which is actual compulsory treatment for drug addicts. And so now all they were left with was, again, decriminalization and needle exchanges. And to a lot of people on the left, I've heard people on the left say, well, that's all you're saying is we just have to continue funding the compulsory treatment, and then the program works fine. And my response to that is, you don't understand. The reason they couldn't afford the program anymore was because the number of drug users jumped dramatically. It was something like a 64% increase in drug use. So you can't actually keep this static. You can't just say, we're just going to keep pumping money into drug addict treatment if the population of drug addicts just keeps growing and growing and growing and growing. Eventually, even the most flush healthcare system in the world is going to be overwhelmed by the amount of drug addicts. Because drugs are special, right? They're not like a lot of other products. They have a physiological change. They make a physiological change in the consumer that requires them to have more of it. It requires them to have a lot more of it over and over again. So there was this contradiction really built into the system, which said, like, we're going to be completely ambivalent about drug use, but we're going to really enforce drug addiction treatment. Well, one of those had to give at some point, and the one that gave was the one that was actually effective, which was the drug treatment. So then all you have left is this ambivalent attitude toward drug use, which has resulted in a really kind of dystopian scene. I mean, the Washington Post went over there, and the scene they talk about is this, healthcare worker just looking for the last plump veins in this one guy's body to pump heroin into. And her face just says, like, this is her job. She's just there to facilitate this. And it's kind of a horrific scene. I mean, that should not be considered healthcare, right? Like, that shouldn't be considered the way we're fixing a problem. It seems, grotesque. But this was the model, and this was what many people in Pennsylvania and what many people in America thought would work here, and it hasn't.
I mean, frankly, it's even worse in the U.S. because at least like there's some semblance of a health system there, and these other aspects. So it's like in America, it's like let's just do the most libertarian version of this, and this really gets, I think, to like a fundamental aspect of this, and it's just why it's such a weird thing for like the left to be so involved in the way that it is that, like, as Matt was saying, and I know you've said similar things in the past, like a fairly libertarian solution is sort of like, and it's very individualistic too, because in America we're just sort of like, hey, deal with it. Maybe some social nonprofit organizations might be getting involved, but for the most part the state's hands off. And I want to throw it to you to talk a little bit about the NGOs in a second, but just anecdotally, and we can't get into this here, but I remember here in Austin, Texas, there's been a lot of stuff around like homelessness and like homeless rights, and the right wing put together this really nasty camping ban, right? That was going to cause a lot of harm and pain for people who were homeless. One thing that was really frustrating was that like the left didn't really have like a solution to the crisis of homelessness. And I remember we were at a meeting and somebody's some libertarian person was literally like an actual libertarian was like, well, we should just let people build shanty towns, right? And all these leftists were really offended at that. But it's like, this is sort of what this position is, right? It's just sort of like we just won't break them up. So there are sometimes I find like a little bit of a disconnect between like the policies that are advocated by the left in this country and like the very real like kind of individualistic like libertarian nature of a lot of them.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And I think what it comes down to is, the left today, I think, is a strange amalgamation of the old left of the 1930s and the new left of 68. And there's this attempt, I think, by millennial leftists, for lack of a better word, the kind of post-Bernie left, to have both of those things happening all at once at the same time, right? To be pro-statist, to be interested in like actually building up in, an economic, engine for the working class and a welfare state that can actually support decent working class life. And at the same time, a very intense desire to be anti-norm, to be kind of transgressive, permissive. And I think the challenge is there's a reason those things have often found themselves at odds. And there's a reason why that kind of 68er sensibility, that ultra-permissive sensibility, finds its home with libertarians. Because it is an individualist sensibility. It says, I don't have a responsibility to society, and society better not try to impose anything upon me, right? And so there's this uneasiness living with the contemporary left where one side of it is saying, no, we do want the state to regulate. We do want the state to come in and invest. We do want the state to do all this stuff. And then there's this other side that's saying, but I don't really want the state to tell me what to do. And that contradiction can't live forever. One side's going to win out. And more often than not, because this is America, the libertarian side wins out. So I often tell people, I'm like, if you advocate this kind of both libertarian and leftist thing all the time, only one of them is going to win. It's always libertarian.
Because the wealthier people in the coalition prefer that stuff. I mean, we were talking before you got on about the stuff in Canada with the euthanasia stuff. And in a vacuum, like, I think I can be persuaded about the right to end one's own life. In practice, when you see it's like working class people or people poor that have been broken down by society, you start to think like, oh, well, maybe like we should be a little bit more skeptical about the ideas that the state is willing to run with when it's, ran by liberals and conservatives.
No, it's a great example, Matt. And it's one of these examples that, again, this was a libertarian and left coalition that pushed through MAID. And it was, many people thought any objection to it could only be this kind of hoary, moralist, conservative objection that was like, well, you're not, with it. You're not hip to, our new level of individualist sensibility. And really, the objection is always in the social conditions that we are in. This will only redound toward the weak, the poor, the mentally challenged, the disabled are going to be the people who lose in this situation. And that's exactly what we've seen. Many people who otherwise would not have committed suicide or otherwise would not have ended their lives have ended them as a result of those conditions. And it's a disaster.
Yeah, and like again, there's like a very bourgeois aspect to like the drug use conversation in America, right? Because it's like for some people, it's like drugs are the things you do when you're in college, right? Which is a certain experience that a certain group of the population gets to have, and when you're at a party or things like that, versus like what the actual experience of like drugs are for a lot of working class people, which is desperation, extremely dangerous, and something that preys upon these communities. And
yeah, I think that class aspect of it isn't talked about enough either. Like, a lot of the people who have very permissive attitudes toward drugs imagine themselves as the drug user, right? And they're people who are fairly middle class, maybe professional class, and they think, yeah, why shouldn't I be able to try a little heroin? There was a New York Times professor who was writing about how you could have safe, a New York University professor writing about how you could have safe heroin use in the New York Times. And, he's imagining his class. He's imagining people who have like very stable lives, high incomes. And, sure, it's easy when you have all that kind of social support to maybe try heroin and then, not try it anymore. But for the vast majority of heroin users, that's not how it goes. It goes in a very different and dark place because they don't have that kind of life and they can't rely on, other kind of social networks and things to kind of keep them away from addiction.
Even keeping away from addiction, but like, dealing with some of the consequences of addiction, right? I mean, just doing too much, not being able to attend work for a lot of working class people, that means they're done. If you're a wealthy person, like you get away with it, right? Just like in those kind of things that create like these really nasty cycles, you have like a little bit of a shield here. But I mean, there's so much more we're still going to get to here, but I really want to like zero in on this because I think that this is a really important part of your piece and also other pieces that you've written before. It's like there's this real hesitation to think about what like to be able to talk the level of like morality in the first sense, but also to imagine like what a good or better life can be. Like politically, I mean, I'll just say this is like so much of like what the left does in this country is oppose things, and I'm not saying that's necessarily wrong. Right, there's a lot of things that are worth opposing, but so much of our position is not kind of affirmative or like aspirational. We're going to do something. It's like, all right, let's stop the state from doing this to this community or that to that community. And there's a real hesitancy, I think, and I don't know if where you think it comes from. Is it from a political weakness? Is it from a kind of like a pessimistic view that like nothing can get better?
Yeah, I mean, the lack of like moral clarity and positive moral vision from the left, I think, stems from a feeling that, any kind of prescriptive moral program is inherently restrictive, right? And it is inherently, it's saying that maybe there are activities that you shouldn't participate in. And maybe there are activities that are better for you and better for society if they weren't allowed or if they weren't encouraged. And that sits really uneasily. And not just with the left, it sits uneasy with most people in a kind of liberal capitalist order because the one, conceit of liberal capitalism is you get to do what you want. It's like the one thing you get is to be able to do what you want. And so to turn around and say, no, we're going to say, some of this behavior is bad and it's bad for society and it's bad for you, is looked at very suspiciously. And, I think for us, we need to make the moral case repeatedly that, without a vision of the good life, without a vision of like what human flourishing looks like, we're never going to have a convincing argument. Because people don't just want to hear, as you said, opposition to things, and they don't just want to hear utopian ideas that like actually you can have everything. You can be a total piece of shit who just does nothing but drink and do drugs all day, and the state's going to give you money every day to do that. You know what I mean? And that's not a vision people find attractive, and it's not a vision people are going to politically want to rally behind. So we have to reckon with what does it take for human beings to really get the most out of their very short time on Earth, and how do you build a political vision around that? And for my money, it's definitely not a vision that says, basically rampant drug use, gambling, and, all this other stuff is actually just good, and we should just affirm it all the time. It's a vision that says those things are probably social and moral evils that if we didn't live in the kind of society that we live in, we would mostly choose not to opt into those things. We would mostly try to avoid those things.
Sometimes it's just like, obviously like we want to see quantitative changes in like most working people's lives in the sense of like, I want people to have more money, but also like a qualitative difference in like how people are living. And so many of even like kind of aspirational, I mean, it does feel a little romantic to think back to like 2015 to 2020 now. Because at least there were some books I disagree with, like, for example, like The Fully Automated Luxury Communism wasn't really my cup of tea, but man, I do sort of miss at least people thinking about exciting things. But a lot of times that was just sort of like, a lot of, and I shouldn't invoke them, but like there are these kind of arguments that are sort of like, oh, if the bank account goes up for workers, like life will be better, just on that level. Yeah. It's like, don't get me wrong, I think it'd be great if people had more money in their pocket, but also like we want more than just like, I don't know, consumer society to like explode, in our vision of the future.
Yeah, and I think that, one reason why the UBI kind of idea took off among both people, again, on the libertarian right and on the left, is because it was a vision that said you could have your cake and eat it too. You could actually have the kind of like robust social welfare state and never have to like work, for instance. And so what? What are we then? We're just people who sit on Amazon and social media all day. Like, is that the vision of the society that we think is good? Can at that point we inscribe upon our banners that we've achieved socialism? I don't think so, and I don't think people want that. I don't think it's good for a human life to live that kind of life.
Yeah, no, I mean, totally. It's, I can't remember who said it, but it was like, that was a very much like a kind of grad school fantasy. But I wanted, like, zooming it back to like this specific question about drug use here. We've talked about like the left in general. But I mean, who is this kind of coalition that is pushing this? In particular, I'm curious about like the NGO stuff, because I'll find on a lot of these kind of questions, there are kind of people in the community, in the political scene, who get to sort of walk up and they're the expert. And it is always sometimes, justified, and other times it's sort of like, who put this person in charge to be able to speak about drug abuse or crime or homelessness? Oftentimes it's because they have some relationship to an NGO. But I'm just curious, in your experience, this kind of social and political group that's sort of behind these kind of policies in Philly or just in general.
Yeah, it's NGOs. I mean, you hit the nail on the head. It's foundation-funded NGOs that have, more money than you like. When you look at the budgets of these organizations, you're blown away because you don't understand, what they're even doing. But they have staffs full of people, and they have lobbyists, and they have, all the things that you need to make the kind of political arguments, and they're politically connected, right? And the thing that's frustrating about this is they get to set the common sense of the left. They get to be the ones who set what is considered, because we don't have, popular left-wing institutions that have democratic, well-organized debates and deliberations where we can say, no, actually, this is the position. We agree with this, The common sense of the left gets to be set by these private organizations that are, just the charity arms of business firms, right? And it's this weird thing where somehow people see these, and they see that word nonprofit, and they assume that somehow these things are actually good or doing, something that's socially beneficial, when they're very rarely doing anything at all other than creating jobs for their friends and other people with credentials to be full-time, activists, quote unquote. But yeah, it's most of the harm reduction stuff in Philadelphia has been led by a couple NGOs that have done a remarkable amount of work to paint this as, not only the progressive position, but a popular position, which it is not. All of the evidence suggests that it is not a popular position, and it's a position that's actually quite disliked by a lot of people who live in Kensington. But yeah, I mean, like everything else in America, the foundation money has a lot to do with it.
But it's such I think it's such an issue for our movement and for the left, particularly like post Bernie, right? There's plenty of this within the Bernie movement too, kind of NGO-ism stuff going on there. But right now, it feels like a lot of the left and that kind of Bernie movement, people associated with it, have sort of become like foot soldiers for politics that's not even ours, right? Because oftentimes a lot of the people who are putting these policies in place are more on, let's call it like the Elizabeth Warren wing of the Democratic Party, a group of people that we consider to be enemies just, a few years back, and rightfully so, in my opinion. And now, I think it's really dangerous that we're not kind of setting the terms of the debate on these questions anymore. And yeah, and I love the term, that these folks are able to sort of set the common sense of the left, because it puts us into a place where we're not the ones doing the thinking, but we might be the ones, showing up and, sort of pushing for a certain kind of progressive politicians, who sort of, are adherents of this kind of NGO worldview.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And I think the frustrating part too is, it's all structural, right? Because many people, when they get jobs in these organizations, that's their job. It's their job is to promote and publicize the ideas of their NGO and that whole layer of NGOs, right? It's not just the one or two NGOs, but they look out for each other and they look out for the best interests of those other organizations that are like theirs. And that's really tough to combat. It's very hard to combat it because they have a lot of money, they have a lot of media connections, they have a lot of political connections, and they speak a language that, sounds like our own and kind of rhymes with what, a genuine socialist movement might be trying for. And it's, they're just right there with the liberals or the libertarians, 9 times out of 10.
So I'm hearing it already. People type in angry comments that we had Dino on here to talk about just throwing everybody in prison. I mean, I know it's a little ridiculous, but I want to give you a chance to sort of anticipate and respond to this because I do think people see only two paths, right? It's hardcore war on drugs, lock entire generations of people in jail, or harm reduction. Matt, you had something you want to add too?
Well, I was just going to say, like, the people that take these videos of, addicts strung out in the street, often their implicit message is like, why haven't the cops warehoused these people out of my vision yet? So I think, we can distinguish ourselves from that pretty easily.
Yeah, I mean, and I'll say, I think the harm reduction stuff, I think, is an overcorrection for the war on drugs, right? Like, it was a feeling that the war on drugs was so, so draconian, so over the top, so bad, and it didn't work. So let's go in the other direction, right? So I do think there's something to that. But that suggests, too, that the overcorrection to harm reduction should not then be, let's immediately revert back to just throwing everybody in jails, right? So the argument that I make at the end of this is, it's a little tongue-in-cheek, but I mean it in the sense that I think that what's missing from all of these strategies is real federal investment in addiction resources, right? And we need a vision that says this problem isn't Philadelphia's problem. This is a national problem, and we know it's a national problem. I mean, it's in Oregon, it's in West Virginia, it's in California, it's in Pennsylvania, it's all over the country. Addiction is a major, major problem. And it is insane that we don't have a federal response to it. We're just saying, states and cities should deal with this on their own. So I think effectively what we need is massive federal resources in addiction treatment centers that can be free at the point of use and public. I also think we need, and this is the part that I think the libertarian left will get very upset with, compulsory treatment. That is, if you're out on the street and you're consistently getting high publicly, somebody has to come tap you on the shoulder and say, hey, listen, you're going into a treatment center. And that's just a fact. Either you stop using or we're putting you in a treatment center. And I really don't see any way out of this without that kind of treatment. Well, I do see another way out of it, which is extremely reactionary and draconian, which is unfortunately what's likely to happen. But I don't see a humane way out of this that goes down either the libertarian left path or the let's throw everybody in rotting jail cells path. And if we can't articulate one that says, no, actually, the only real solution is one that says we have to provide addiction treatment and we have to actually pay for it, we're going to be left with this problem for a very long time.
Yeah. And I think, like a lot of these things, it's cheap. And that's a whole other can of worms, in
the here and now, it's cheap.
Yeah, no, what I'm saying is like the harm reduction is cheap, right? And it's like a lot of, homelessness too. It's like, all right, we'll just let people create, whatever kind of accommodations they can figure out on their own, right? That's another kind of cheap solution to like a massive social problem. And like, we need to like have some, I don't know, backbone to stand up to this very, very miserly state that's willing to let people suffer a lot.
Yeah, no, I mean, you hit the nail on the head there, David. Because one of the reasons that we chose both the war on drugs and harm reduction is because both are cheaper than actually establishing like a massive public medical system that could handle addiction, right? And I don't think people realize just how much cheaper these things are. But the simple reason why no politician wants to stand up and say, you know, I'm introducing a bill in Congress to pay for, you know, addiction treatment for anybody who needs it, is because as soon as they look at the price tag of that bill, they immediately look for a cheaper solution. They're going to immediately start looking for something that doesn't cost any money, and they can still say that they've helped, and they can still say that they've won, and that they really care about the addicts. They really do, and they're proving it to you by, you know, giving a couple $1 million to some foundation, rather than investing the billions, if not trillions of dollars needed into a public health system.
Yeah, I think it's a very, very good point, actually. That don't let them get away with this sleight of hand that we've been seeing. Dino, I really appreciate you spending some time with us today on the program. I will suggest folks go and subscribe to Damage Magazine. You can read Dino's other pieces in there. They're all really, really phenomenal. Really appreciate you taking the time again, brother.
No, thanks for having me, guys. I appreciate it.